Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the Necrolord single target rotation for Shadow Priests. So let's just get right into it. These are the talents you're going to want to run. Fortress of the Mind, Body and Soul, Twist of Fate, Psychic Horror, Auspicious Spirits, Void Torrent instead of Mindbender, I'll talk about that in a second, and Hungering Void. So you'll notice that if you watched my previous single target rotation video that talked about the Night Fae single target rotation, they play Mindbender. Necrolords play Void Torrent. The reason behind this is because Void Torrent, if you take all legendaries out of the equation, Void Torrent is more single target damage, but when you play Night Fae, or if you're a Necrolord playing Keys, you play Shadowflame Prism as your legendary, and Shadowflame Prism gives Mindbender a ton of value. Your Mindbender puts your Shadow Fiend, it replaces Shadow Fiend and drops the cooldown from 3 minutes to 1 minute, which means that you get way more damage from your legendary by playing Mindbender. But in single target, Necrolord Shadow Priests don't play Shadowflame Prism, we play Pallid Command. And because we're playing Pallid Command, we no longer play Mindbender. We go back to the higher single target damage, which is Void Torrent. And then, again, the last one is Hungering Void, because you want the longest Void forms that you can get. So those are the talents. You'll also see I'm playing Plague Deviser Merilith. I'll go ahead and open up my Soulbind and talk about the conduits I choose. So this is, I'm not going to go too in-depth because I've recorded this video like 6 times already and gone way too in-depth in all this stuff. But if you do have any questions or anything, like deep questions, why did I choose this conduit over this conduit, or why do I cast this ability before this ability kind of thing, I'll talk about briefly that stuff. I'll talk about that stuff briefly in this video, but there's a link in the description to my Discord server, so feel free to join it. There are about 300 people in there as of making this video. The majority of them play Shadow Priest, so if you want to ask questions about Shadow Priest, that's a pretty good resource. And I can get back to you and type out walls of text, right? Where I go really in depth to answer your questions. So feel free to join and hit me up. But yeah, I'm going to try and keep this video as brief as I can. So these are the conduits you want to run. I'll briefly mention, as of making this video, 64 renown is the most that you can have, which means that the first row of conduits is empowered, and the empowered conduit that you want to use for single target for Necrolord is Haunting Apparitions. So make sure that your Mind Devourer and your Dissonant Echoes aren't in this conduit slot. That one should be Haunting Apparitions, and then it doesn't matter where you put these two. If you're watching this video in the future, though, and all of them are empowered, or 2 of them are empowered, or whatever, then your next best bet would be Mind Devourer. So I would empower this one, empower Mind Devourer, and then lastly I would empower Dissonant Echoes. If you have all 3, then it doesn't matter. These are the ones you want to use. But if you're trying to decide which ones to put where, this is how I would do it. And then I run Clear Mind as a finesse conduit because there are several things that you need to mass dispel in Sanctum of Domination. And I run Translucent Image and Condensed Animosphere as my defensive conduits, although there's an argument to be made for Light's Inspiration over Condensed Animosphere. But it's not a huge difference typically, and it's just kind of up to you. And playing Condensed Animosphere is very passive. You don't ever have to press anything for this to work, whereas with Light's Inspiration, that'll only work if you press Desperate Prayer. So its value is kind of tied to how you play around it, whereas this one is completely passive. The one that I will say, you always want to play Translucent Image. That's just for certain, because it turns Fade into a really big defensive cooldown on a 30-second cooldown, which is insane. And then the other stuff, just make sure you go like this, do what I did, because it's good, because I said so. Again, if you want to talk more in depth or anything, feel free to join my Discord server, or just leave a comment and I'll try and get back to you if you have any disagreements or you want to know more info. Okay, so those are the conduits. That's the Soulbind you want to run. Always Plague Deviser Merilith. And then I'm going to do a pull timer right here, just because there are 2 things that you have to do as a Shadow Priest before you pull the boss. So the first thing is you need to cast Fleshcraft And the second thing is you need to pre-cast a Vampiric Touch. So Fleshcraft, when you play Plague Deviser Merilith, I'll spare the details, but it gives you 120 mastery for 2 minutes whenever you press Fleshcraft, and you don't have to full channel it. So what I'm going to do, I do full channel it in this case because I have the time, but moving into the future, like mid-pull, if you want to press your Fleshcraft to get the mastery buff, you only have to tap it, and then you can, go back to casting other stuff. You don't have to full channel. But yeah, it gives you mastery, so you want to press it before the pull because it's just going to make all your damage higher. So I press it at about 6 seconds, but you can wait until maybe 5. You definitely don't want to start casting it below 5 seconds before pull because you want to make sure you have enough time to pre-cast a Vampiric Touch as well. So if you keep an eye on this pull timer, I full channel the Fleshcraft, and then when the timer gets down to about 1.2, 1.1 or so, I start casting the Vampiric Touch. That's because with my level of haste, my Vampiric Touch is about a 1.1, 1.2 second cast. If you have very low haste, maybe 10% or less, then you're going to want to start casting this a little bit earlier. You can hover over your Vampiric Touch, and it'll give you the cast time, and you want to cast it at exactly that number. So if it's a 1.1 second cast, I would start casting it now because you want it to hit exactly at 0. And then if you keep an eye over here, you'll get a list of all the stuff I'm casting. So I pre-cast the Vampiric Touch, and I start spamming my Shadow Word Pain button so that it goes off right as my Vampiric Touch finishes casting. Because you want these dots up for the entire fight. And then as soon as I cast my Shadow Word Pain, I start channeling my Void Torrent. And I'll mention, you'll see at this point in time, my Void Torrent is still casting, but I have more than 50 Insanity. I could cast a Devouring Plague here, but what I'm going to do is full channel this Void Torrent. And then once it finishes, I cast the Devouring Plague. And then I cast Mind Blast into Shadow Fiend. And then as soon as I press Shadow Fiend, I'm going to press my Soul Letting Ruby. This is so that this crit that's coming to me from this projectile. Oh, M1QQ, thanks for the follow, by the way. As this projectile is coming towards me, I want this to hit me as soon as I get into Voidform. So I press it a little bit early compared to some other Shadow Priests that I've watched, just because I want it, I'm trying to time it to line up with my Voidform. I don't want to get it after I'm already in Voidform and my damage has already gone out. So I press it a little bit early, but it does kind of depend on how close you are to the boss. If you're really close, you can press it later. If you're really far away, you can press it a little bit earlier even. But pressing it right after your Shadow Fiend is good enough. The difference between pressing it right after that or after your Mind Blast or after your first Devouring Plague is going to be very, very small. So don't worry about it too much. Just cast it right after your first Shadow Fiend. And then I immediately get into Void Form. Very first spell in Void Form is going to be a Void Bolt. And then in between casting this Void Bolt and casting this Unholy Nova, you're in between globals. So for anyone who doesn't know, there are certain abilities that you can only cast on certain times. It's called the global cooldown. So every time you cast an ability, all of your other abilities that are on the global cooldown are locked out and you can't cast them. And then as soon as the global cooldown finishes, you can cast again. But there are certain abilities that aren't on the global cooldown, which means you can press them literally whenever you want, right? And so what you do is there are 2 abilities that you want to press right after this first Void Bolt that are off the global cooldown, and that's this Power Infusion and this Potion of Spectral Intellect. So what you do is you press Void Bolt, and then in between your Void Bolt and your next spell that's on the global cooldown, which is Unholy Nova, you can press these 2 buttons as well. So you press Void Bolt, Power Infusion, Potion of Spectral Intellect, Unholy Nova immediately, and you waste no time because you can fit these 2 in between those 2 globals. And by moving Soul Letting Ruby right after your Shadow Fiend, instead of putting it in here with these 2 other spells, you go down from pressing 3 different things between the globals to 2 different things. Okay, so then you're going to cast your Unholy Nova. This will spawn Kevin Zoozling and your Rattling Mage, which is going to do a ton of damage. And then I'm over 50 Insanity. My Unholy Nova just hit, and I've got 2 stacks of Mind Blast. So I'm going to cast a Mind Blast to make sure that I'm not sitting on 2 stacks, start the charges recharging. And then my Void Bolt comes off cooldown, so I press that. You're going to want a Void Bolt, then 2 spells, then a Void Bolt. That's what you should be doing in Voidform. So Void Bolt, doesn't matter, Void Bolt. Every single time. If you get over like 160% haste or something, I think the real number is like 147%, but if you're like at way high levels of haste, then you can fit one thing between Void Bolts. But I don't even know if it's worth it at that point. At any level of haste that you'll typically be at, you should be doing Void Bolt, 2 spells, Void Bolt, 2 spells, Void Bolt. So you'll see I cast Void Bolt, Devouring Plague. Next is going to be a Mind Blast, and then back to a Void Bolt, Devouring Plague, another Devouring Plague, Void Bolt. I'll mention right there, the reason I cast 2 Devouring Plagues there is because I got a Mind Devourer proc, which meant that the first Devouring Plague cost no insanity. You'll pretty much never be able to cast 2 Devouring Plagues back to back like this, unless you're at like almost 100 insanity, or you get a Mind Devourer proc. And if you get the Mind Devourer proc, you don't always want to cast 2 Devouring Plagues back to back. It's just that it was my second global between Void Bolts, so I cast it there. And then I Mind Blast, Devouring Plague, Void Bolt, Mind Blast, Mind Flay, because I don't have enough for a Devouring Plague. I don't have enough insanity. As soon as I do get enough insanity, I should cancel this Mind Flay for a Devouring Plague. So unlike Void Torrent, with my Void Torrent in the beginning, I didn't cancel it. I full channeled it so that I could do all of the damage before I cast Devouring Plague. With Mind Flay, it's different. Mind Flay doesn't do enough damage for you to want to full channel it every time. You only want to channel it until you can press something that does more damage, which in this case is Devouring Plague. You can interrupt it with a Mind Blast, you can interrupt it with a Void Bolt. Anything pretty much does more damage than Mind Flay at most levels of haste. But yeah, so definitely cancel your Mind Flays, and you don't have to like press escape or move to cancel it. Just cast something else and it'll cancel it itself. So I cancel this Mind Flay with a Devouring Plague right here, and then I Mind Flay again, Void Bolt, Mind Blast, Devouring Plague, Void Bolt, Devouring Plague, Mind Blast, Void Bolt, Devouring Plague. I got another Mind Devourer proc right there, so I cast a second Devouring Plague again, and then I drop out of Voidform, and so I go back to my single target, my like sustain rotation, outside of cooldowns rotation, which is you want to Void Torrent as often as possible, and you pretty much never want to Void Torrent while you're in Voidform. So my Void Torrent came off cooldown while I was in Voidform, but I didn't use it until I dropped out of Voidform, and then it's the first thing I use as soon as I'm out of Voidform, just because you've got more important spells to cast during Voidform, and the channel is so long that if you cast it during Voidform, you're going to miss Void Bolts, or you'll miss Mind Blasts, or you'll overcap on Insanity, all sorts of things. So as soon as I drop out of Voidform, I Void Torrent, I get enough for another Devouring Plague, and then I notice my Shadow Word Pain's about to fall off, so I Shadow Word Pain, and then the boss is now in execute range. It just barely went below 20% HP, so I'm going to re-up my Vampiric Touch, make sure that these never fall off. That should be a big priority for you. If you're trying to do more damage, make sure that you always have Vampiric Touch up, and you always have Shadow Word Pain up, and then try to keep Devouring Plague up as often as possible. I will also mention I got some feedback from my last rotation video where there's an argument to be made that you should have Devouring Plague up for every Mind Blast. That should be the priority, not having it up as long as possible. And for me, that kind of depends on your insanity generation, and it's a really nuanced argument, and the person who talked to me about it, we talked a lot and couldn't come to a great conclusion, but just as a general rule of thumb, try to do both. Try to have Devouring Plague up for as much of the boss fight as you can, so only press it again if you have a ton of insanity, or if it's about to fall off. Same with Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain, you should only ever press these if they're about to fall off. But always try to have all 3 dots up at the same time if you're going to cast a Mind Blast, because it'll do more damage. Okay, so then I re-up my Vampiric Touch, I press a Devouring Plague, and then because the boss is in execute range, I'm going to hit it with a Shadow Word Death. That's something that's different from Night Fae as well. You will never press Shadow Word Death outside of execute range unless you're moving. Shadow Word Death is fine to press while you're running around. And then you'll also notice something, those who are well, everybody now, because I'm going to point it out, but I press Fade I press Shadow Word Death and I immediately press Fade. This is because Shadow Word Death, when it doesn't kill something, deals the damage back to you. And Fade, because it's on a 30-second cooldown, because I'm playing Translucent Image, the conduit, means that this Shadow Word Death damage that's going to hit me is going to do less damage. It's going to do about 10% less damage because I've got Translucent Image running. So that's why I pressed Fade there. Typically, on most raid bosses, you're going to want to save Fade for certain mechanics. But because it's on such a low cooldown, only 30 seconds, there are plenty of times where you can press Fade right after you press Shadow Word Death. And if you're like out doing world content, or you're in a dungeon or something, pressing Fade after your Shadow Word Deaths, like right after, because it has to be before the damage hits you, is a good thing and a habit that you should get into. So I press Fade there, and then I'm back into a Mind Flay. I cancel it immediately with a Mind Blast, but then I have nothing else to press, so I press Mind Flay again, but then I get a Mind Devourer proc, so I press Devouring Plague, and then I'm going to go back to Mind Flay because I got nothing else to press. I channeled this one for a long time, but if you watch down here, I was spamming my Devouring Plague button. That's because as soon as I get over 50 Insanity, I want to hit a Devouring Plague and cancel this Mind Flay. And then my Shadow Word Pain is about to fall off, so I cast that Devouring Plague, and then I Shadow Word Pain again, and then I Mind Blast, and then I Mind Flay, and now I notice that my Shadow Word Death is about to come off cooldown, so I start spamming that button so that it goes off as soon as possible. I actually Devouring Plague instead because I got enough Insanity for it. And then I use a Dark Thoughts proc while I'm channeling Mind Flay right there. And then my Vampiric Touch is about to fall off, so I use that, and then I Shadow Word Death. And then my Void Torrent comes off cooldown, so I press that again. Again, I full channel that. And then I Devouring Plague, Shadow Word Pain. And then we get to the point where Unholy Nova has come back off cooldown. And I'll just say this real quick about Necrolord Shadow Priest cooldowns. In pretty much all raid bosses, you're going to want to use Unholy Nova as soon as it comes up every single time. And then you're going to want to save every Void Form for Power Infusion, except for your last Void Form, if it means that you're going to lose a use of Void Form, right? So if Void Form comes off cooldown, Power Infusion has 30 seconds left on cooldown, and the boss is going to die within the next 20 seconds, let's say, then you should use that Void Form so that you get it before the boss dies, right? Because the boss will die if you hold it for Power Infusion, and you won't get the use, right? I will also say there should be a big asterisk in front of that statement I just said, because that is definitely not optimal in every case. There are lots of times where you should do other stuff, but in the general case, which is the only way I can really teach in this video, I can just give you stuff for most cases. In general, saving every Void Form for every Power Infusion will do good damage, right? It's like pretty much optimal. Except, like I said, your very last Void Form, if it's going to mean that you don't use the Void Form, then you should use it before Power Infusion comes off cooldown. But then, yeah, with Shadow Fiend, again, that's one that you just send on cooldown, basically. Unless the boss is like... unless it's like a 4-minute boss fight, 4:10 or something, then maybe you want to save your second Shadow Fiend and line it up with your other cooldowns. But Shadow Fiend is such a lame ability to press. It does like no damage, so it doesn't matter too much when you press it. I just send it on cooldown, basically. But yeah, that's basically all the cooldowns. That's basically what you want to be doing during your cooldowns. And then between cooldowns, you just want to make sure your dots are up at all times. You're casting Devouring Plagues and Mind Blasts when you can, and then filling with Mind Flay. And yeah, I mean, that's basically it. So if you guys liked the video, make sure you click the like button. If you really liked it, feel free to hit the subscribe button. I do plan on making more videos, although I know there's been a decent amount of time between this one and my last one. I'll just say real quick that that's because I've been super busy. If you want to know more, feel free to join my Discord, where I made an announcement about what's been going on. There's a link in the description if you want to catch up. But yeah, otherwise, that's going to be it for this video, so thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace!